what are the issues with assessing group work?
I wouldn't start by talking about assessment and group work. I talk about how are we assessing the graduate attributes and the competencies and the content, and what are the appropriate assessment techniques to use for that. So I think the conversation has to be about how do you do assessment in general, and then when is group work appropriate, and what are the appropriate assessment strategies to use depending on what your learning objectives are. Right? And this gives rise then to a conversation about formative assessment and summative assessment. So maybe Kevin, you'd like to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of variants of the definitions, but very simply you might think of formative assessment as being where the assessment is designed to generate learning in the student, whereas summative assessment is assessment of learning, and most assessment will have some element of both, but you can be at either pole, I guess, as well.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about assessment, it always comes back to the purpose of using group work in the first place. I think mostly we're talking about graded group assignments, so there's always that summative, that evaluative component in there, and that of course opens up a lot of issues about fairness, individual versus group performance, inputs versus outputs, and so on and so forth. But the fundamental question of group work, and certainly when we were discussing the reasons for group work, it's very clear that we're trying to help students develop skill sets and develop themselves, and for that the formative assessment is important. So a balance between the two, I think, is crucial, simply because doing only one of the two is a missed opportunity. And I think that the issues and challenges that come up especially when colleagues who have not used group work before that are identified and talked about, all of them can be overcome, but none of them can be overcome fully. Then again, an essay exam is not necessarily a great way of assessing things either, just because we're all used to it and many of us have used it for many years doesn't make it a good form of assessment. So I think this is a very pragmatic issue of how do we assess exactly the key points of what we're trying to bring about with students, in students, or help them to bring about.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we start from where Brendan has suggested we start from, that we think about the assessment in terms of what are we actually trying to assess, and then we start the conversation about how do we assess. And sometimes we're interested in the output and sometimes we're interested in the process. So if we're talking about a group effort of some sort, then we may have an element that we're interested in developing competencies in the students around communication, collaboration, but we may also have a content-specific element that we're looking to the assessment as a generative process to create some artifact or synthesize some knowledge or whatever is appropriate to the particular domain. So I think we should, as academics and course developers, think carefully about the reasons why we're putting this in front of the student, what we're trying to achieve, right, and then choose the appropriate assessment.
You need to make what you're doing explicit. So if you're developing curriculum content in a particular area, or if there's some skills that are your learning objectives, that needs to be made very explicit for the student, and the way in which assessment is to be done needs to be made explicit as well. And this can't, so it needs to be made very explicit. There are a whole myriad of techniques that can be used, and a combination of group components and individual components. These can be weighted in different ways. So you can do things that if people don't get a sufficient mark on an individual component, then they're not entitled to the group mark. You can have internal peer grading within groups. You can have peer grading between groups. So there's a whole variety of different assessment strategies that can be used, and it's not about one size fits all. It's about putting together a mix of summative, formative, peer, external assessment, and putting that mix together in an explicit fashion so that you're hitting the learning objectives and people know what's happening.
Picking up on the point that Brendan made earlier about linking assessment to the learning outcomes, I think the key part of assessment is actually the design of the content of the group work, because that is the means by which much of what can be assessed in group project is assessed. So the design of the actual task is absolutely crucial. And if I look at my own practice over the years, if I could go back 20 years, that's where I would invest most of my time, to designing better group projects that are more aligned with what I actually want students to learn and what I want students to be able to do after they have completed it.
So the Trinity Education Project is really calling on everybody to look at how assessment is done at a programmatic level. So group work is a pedagogy that fits in there, but then you're going to need a variety of assessment techniques across the whole programme, so that you make sure that at the end of the programme all the objectives have been met. So there's no one answer, but I think we're going to have conversations about how we do assessment anyway, and group work and assessment of group work is part of that.